And welcome to the Wall Street Blockchain Alliance's Crypto Roundup. Today is Friday, October 6th. Where does the time go? I am Quaranta, chair of the Wall Street Blockchain Alliance, with my good friends and co-hosts David Brill and Josh Klayman. David, Josh, good morning. Good afternoon.
Good morning, Ron. Coming to you from Fort Lauderdale. How are things?
Keeping busy. And Josh, I'm going to dive right into it. There's a lot for us to cover. I have not brought the popcorn and gone to 500 Pearl Street. But the SBF trial has begun in earnest, and I've seen a lot of interesting news. You were there yesterday, I think, correct?
I was.
Spill it. We need to hear what's going on.
Wow. So there's so much. I mean, one of the things, and I've mentioned this in another context, is just the amount of information. When I think about the jury and taking this all in, the amount of information that we have gleaned over the past many years in crypto, right? And also with respect to the finance industry. Right. I mean, how much of this is the jury going to take away, and how much is going to be hanging on, the credibility of the witnesses? I guess, all of it. But yeah, so yesterday was quite a day. There was the continuation of testimony by Adam Yedidia, who was a developer, and there was testimony by Matt Huang of Paradigm, and also by the beginning of testimony by Gary Wang, the former co-founder of FTX and Alameda. And it really, I mean, let me just pause here. There's a lot I could say. There are a lot of startling quotes and moments, but yeah, let me pause.
Josh, before we move forward, embarrassingly, I forgot my disclaimer, which you both know I've memorized. So everyone in the audience, thank you all for joining us on LinkedIn Live and on Twitter. Sorry, it's X. I keep doing that. If you've got comments or questions, please do hit us up in the chat, and please do keep in mind that nothing discussed should be considered accounting, investment, legal, or tax advice. Josh, I'd like to dive in with a question if I could, and David, I hope you don't mind. As I see the updates coming out of the trial, one of the things I always go back to when we were watching FTX implode was this idea that, and again, everyone's given the presumption of innocence, but fraud is fraud. Securities violations are securities violations. So I almost want to look at the case and disintermediate it from crypto. Do you think jurors will see it that way? Do you think the world is seeing it that way?
I mean, I think that's one of the things that the prosecution certainly is trying to do. They're trying to show, I mean, their goal, I believe, right? I'm not a litigator, not a prosecutor, certainly. But I would imagine that their goal is to say, like, look, it doesn't matter that all of this is very intricate. Like, you don't need to know the ins and outs of trading on leverage, right? Or like various other things. But you need to understand that this is a case of simple fraud, right? That, you will see, allegedly, that there were falsehoods, that there were things that were not true that people relied upon, and this was intentional, and et cetera, et cetera. And you'll hear from the defendant's very own friends. And on the other side, I think there is, for the defense, among other things, they want to send a different message, including that, this is a very, very complicated space, right? How could someone be expected to know all the ins and outs, right? And, how much should they be able to rely upon specialists who allegedly may have given them information that they relied on? And so I do think one of the things that came out just in the first day of testimony, where I was not there, but I had the opportunity to review some of what was said, was there was Mr. Juilliard. He was asked by the defense counsel whether he was asked, isn't crypto risky, right? Like, you knew this was a risky area, et cetera. And he had to really emphasize, like, well, whether I thought that the industry or the investments could be volatile is different from whether I thought putting my funds, my fiat or whatever it was, on FTX was risky. And I think that's what is a key point, is saying, like, and this has come up again and again in different testimony, customers of FTX deposited their money. They didn't know. And there were many, many opportunities for them to be told that this money was going into an account, at least at one time, that was belonging to Alameda and held at Silvergate, right?
Yep.
There were instructional videos that we watched that went step by step. You write the beneficiary, you do all this thing. Here's what a stable coin is. Here's how you deposit a stable coin. Here's how you make a wire transfer, etc. But never in those videos did it say, and by the way, your money, it's not being held in your account, right? It's being held by this other entity. So that was interesting.
Josh, thanks for that. David, let's go to you on this. And you and I and Josh have had these conversations many, many times when you get these charismatic founders and really looking at an intriguing space, the crypto space. How far does the shucks, they were just, he was ignorance, he was very enthusiastic, he didn't quite understand. And again, I want to engage the presumption of innocence. I've never met SBF or the team there. But David, how far does ignorance, Curly has a definite opinion on
Curly, yes. Well, look, I think there are a few macro issues to consider.
Yeah.
I think the fact that crypto companies had trouble finding banking partners and had to go to creative means in and of itself doesn't make somebody criminal. And the fact that there was difficulty being banked by banking partners is just an issue that I think should have been addressed a while ago, sort of on a macro level. I think that the regulatory space in the US is very complicated, but that doesn't give you a pass for allegedly taking customer funds and acting as a hedge fund or a VC. So what I would say, it's a mix. I'd say there are certain things that may not have been very clear, but ultimately, like misappropriating customer funds and becoming a VC or a hedge fund is just not something that was ever contemplated by customers.
David, Josh was just about to jump out of her seat in response to something you said. I wanted to get that opportunity.
So again, all based with the presumption of innocence. I would note one thing, though, about the way it's being characterized in terms of the bank account, right? On one hand, it was said like this bank account was used because FTX was having some trouble getting a bank account. But one of the videos that was shown at one point during the day was an excerpt from actually a Blockworks interview of the defendant, Sam Bankman-Fried, in which that actual name was brought up. It was also brought up in testimony about why the name Alameda Research was chosen, right? Because research didn't sound like crypto or trading. And SBF, I think that I don't know how the jury viewed it, but in what was certainly a very casual interview from years ago, SBF said something to the effect of, well, yeah, like couldn't exactly call it like expletive coin day traders Inc. Right? And so only he didn't say expletive. I just don't want to say it on this broadcast.
Please don't.
but yeah. And so, there was chuckling about that. But did this idea that, oh yeah, where's the line between intent, like on one hand, right, intent, which is one of the things that the prosecution is trying to establish, and then on the other hand, just like this allegedly, like a disregard for why these things might be inappropriate or to mislead someone intentionally about what the activities of an entity are. And another place where this came up, and maybe I'm not sure whether it's been reported on, but there was a signal message that was shown. It was entitled People of the House, or it's titled People of the House. And it was among the 10 people who lived in the apartment. And they were discussing how to pay for the expensive apartment in the Bahamas. And someone basically had a concern about paying $15,000 each month. Mm-hmm. And someone else then said, well, I don't think that Caroline, this is my paraphrase, Caroline intended to tie us to the $90,000 number. And someone was saying it was too expensive. I can't remember which. But then they were thinking about how much was to be spent. And SBF on this signal message that was shown said, heh, H-E-H. So like, heh. He said that he he'd been mentally assuming that the aggregate rent collected would be $0. Right. And then he said he would be fine / excited if other people wanted to have economic exposure, but that the expected contribution was 0. And he'd been assuming that it's basically Alameda paying for it in the end. And so I've skipped out some of the words, but many of the part of that is a partial quote, right? And so I think what the prosecution is trying to show is this was not the gravity. The gravity of these things it wasn't reasonable to think that it didn't matter.
And this is willful disregard is where they're going with this. Is that correct? Would you assume?
I mean, I would assume. I think they're also just trying, again, like, I don't know how many of the details about, spot trading versus something else are being taken in by the jury, but really the image that has been being shown by the prosecution, right, is someone who thought that this money allegedly could be used for various purposes. And as the prosecution is weaving the story, how much of that money, that Alameda money, really was FTX customer money. So
and who had control?
Yeah.
David, weigh in on that. And I guess, I don't think either of you has been a defense attorney. I'd love to grab some of our defense attorney colleagues and ask this question. But David, does defense get SBF to testify?
Boy, so the typical playbook is the stronger the case you have, the defendant doesn't testify, and that the facts in many instances are enough if there is a strong defense. But, it's so hard to prognosticate, but it seems, from what I've read, it seems like he will testify in some capacity. But there's always a lot of risks with that, because once you start testifying, you open up doors and you expose yourself to questions that you may not want to answer. So I think time will tell, but my sense is that he will testify in some capacity.
David, Josh, I know I'd read that the trial is estimated to go on for several weeks, probably into the Thanksgiving timeframe, if not longer. I plan to try to drop by at some point. I know it's been a little bit of a media circus. The last question I've gotten, again, as a non-attorney, I'm always fascinated by this. How impactful is it that inner circle all cut deals? And the reason I ask that is I don't think it's clear in the media reporting whether or not a deal was offered to Sam Bankman-Fried, or he simply decided never to take a deal because he might win. Do either of you have an opinion about that?
I do. I've read somewhere, I can't cite it to you off the top of my head, that he wasn't offered a deal. But we can fact check that. So I think what's difficult is for lay people as a jury, when they see people are giving testimony in exchange for immunity or a lightened prosecution, I think in the back of lay people's minds, there's always like, oh, they cut a deal and they're going to say whatever the government wants them to say, or maybe not to that extent, but they're going to give a narrative most favorable to the government in exchange for the terms of their deal. So I think depending on the people on the jury, there's some people that may have a bias that, oh, these people were complicit. They made this deal with the government, so they won't be prosecuted, and they're willing to sort of say, to say what the government's narrative is for the purpose of the court. So that's just something to be aware of, and something to be mindful of as these folks give testimony.
Yeah. Go ahead, Josh. We're going to add something?
Trouble getting off of mute. So my recollection is that somewhere in the opening statement, there was something that intimated that basically it was Sam Bankman-Fried's decision not to engage with in a potential deal. Not that a deal was on the table, but just that. And one of the things in testimony yesterday that the defense counsel was trying to emphasize was that and it was asked of Adam Yedidia multiple times, was like, okay, so you had to be in kind of a rush, right? Prosecutors wanted to hear from you right away, right? so this idea, which I think if we remember back, like it all did happen very, very quickly. So I think my understanding based on the opening statement was that it never, like, perhaps it could have been on the table, a plea deal, but that SBF decided, not to even go there and to decide to defend himself. But I don't know for sure. And then I think some of what you're saying, the defense counsel was really trying to convey to the jury, both in the opening statement where they talked about, like, look, these people took plea deals, right? Think about, like, their motivations, and also saying, like, okay, so you got immunity to testify here. And there was one point at which the defense counsel had been saying to Adam Udidia, so because it had been established, that he was supposed to tell the truth, right? And there was a lot of back and forth between the prosecutor and the defense counsel about, of course, the immunity was limited in the event that he didn't tell the truth. But one of the things the defense counsel was saying, well, who determines whether you're telling the truth? And he was like, the government determines whether you're telling the truth, right? And so on redirect, the prosecutor did ask Adam Udidia, like, what were you told, like, in your preparation? Because of course the defense said, how many times did you meet with them, and went through the various meetings. And basically when the prosecutor redirected and asked, Adam Udidia said, like, I was told to tell the truth. So I actually thought that the witnesses yesterday, to my non-juror mind, I thought that they seemed credible to me. And although some of the statements that were made, like, were really,
by folks giving testimony,
yeah. I mean, some things, like when Gary Wong, who seemed to be the happiest person ever to be testifying, I don't know him, so maybe he wasn't. Maybe that was just, like, my assumption based on his what I assume to be his body language. But he almost gleefully said, that's my impression, not how he actually felt. But he was, like, saying, I committed financial crimes, I committed securities fraud, wire fraud, commodities fraud, right? And not in a way like I committed it, but like I did this, like it was just very, and I did it with these other people, and he named the various other people who pled guilty, and then the defendant. But it was a day of surprises and learning, frankly, some of the preferential treatment that was actually hardwired in the code that Alameda received. Some of it was pretty shocking. So
I suspect we're going to be talking about this trial for the next several episodes of this. Really looking forward to the updates. And my personal opinion, I think when Caroline Ellison testifies, that will be some groundbreaking kind of conversations. I'm looking forward to that. David, do you want to wrap that up? And we've got a lot of other stuff to cover. I just want to be cognizant of time. I just want to ask David if you had anything to add to that.
No, I think it's great Josh has been there and has been really close to it. I do think the subject matter is very complex. Yep. I do think that, I do think some jurors may get caught up in some of the details, because I think, as we know, even in Washington, some people get caught up in some of the details on crypto. So I don't know if we can expect this lay jury with no, training prior to this not to get caught up in some of the details.
I lied a little bit. I want to add one last thing to that, and then we'll wrap it up on the SBF trial. And the reason I bring that up is I had read recently, both of you correct me if I'm wrong, that someone had noted potentially FTX customers might get back substantially all of what they lost in the bankruptcy of FTX. Yes. But I want to point out, from a legal perspective, fraud is fraud, irrelevant of the fact about whether or not customers get their money back. Is that something that both of you think the popular, lay person doesn't know?
I think that is something that the government's going to have to explain out and make their case on. Because right. I think that when we think of fraud, typically we think of like misappropriating funds, to buy a yacht, a plane, or do other things that are not, allowed and really smell of kind of fraud and criminality. I
Yeah.
think some people will have to understand that even though FTX took some customer deposits and became a VC and invested in an AI company that's going to be successful, they might not view that as fraud, but that wasn't what the company was allowed to do.
Right.
So I think those are distinctions that are going to have to be made. And because FTX may have made a very prescient investment in an AI company, and that mark to market may be worth enough to potentially at some point make customers whole, that doesn't mean they were allowed to do it with customer funds or were permitted to do it. So there's a real distinction that has to be made between paying yourself $100 million in salary and, using funds for things that weren't allowed,
Yeah.
by the company.
Yeah.
And David, go ahead, Josh. No, go ahead.
So some of the things that I think, I agree with David, because I think some of what the government was trying to show yesterday, and this came up a lot in Matt Wong's testimony, where they were drilling down into, they had this slide that talked about exchange wallets serving as a full service settlement infrastructure. And they said prime broker, clearing firm, custodian, execution service. And so having people understand what is the expectation of a custodian, right? And how does that tie into this? That's a mental leap, and that's something that we're just trying to figure out on the legal side now. And similarly, there was a lot of discussion and questions about the liquidation engine, right? And query how much people are going to understand what it means to be liquidated. I think later they did. I think Matt Wong did a great job, in my view, of explaining about like if something becomes negative, and why this is so important. But I just think a lot of these concepts in general, there is the possibility of the jury saying this is all very complex, like maybe different people were handling it and maybe then somebody didn't intend, because I think what the defense is going to say is like, and what they were trying to say was that, say, the loans that were made, things like that, that people believed that they were legal, right? And trying to negate that intent. But I do think some of the numbers were just really eye-popping. Like hearing that Alameda had a $65 billion line of credit, whereas a normal market maker would have, as was testified by Gary Wong, between like either a single digit or a double digit million line of credit, among many other things. But also some things towards the end of the day with Gary Wong, where he was testifying about certain loans that he said he was expected to sign, right? And he did sign the paperwork for, but amounts like 200 million to 300 million loaned to him that he signed for that never actually went to him. It went to various companies. Right? Just these sorts of things. I think the web that is being painted, I think some of the numbers really make you sit up and listen. But the judge this will be the last thing I say about it. The judge was really coming down pretty hard on counsel, particularly the defense counsel, about repetition. At the same time, like, while I understand why that may be, reasonable, some of these things, like hearing them many times, if you don't have a financial background or a technical background, I can understand why it would be repeated.
Well, Josh, thanks so much. I know we're going to be talking about this for the next several weeks. Looking forward to the updates. I'm hoping to actually join you, Josh, at one point, should you be going back to, I think it's 500 Pearl is the courthouse. The SBF trial is not the only thing going on in the courts, and I just want to throw something out there. First, obviously, everyone's favorite judge in the crypto space, at least for the time being, Judge Torres, weighed in, rejecting the Security and Exchange Commission's request for interlocutory appeal. David, I want to come back to you on that. And obviously the Ripple folks pointed out, look, and the crypto world writ large, look, the courts are finally understanding and weighing in on what the SEC is doing wrong. How did you see Judge Torres's ruling? And tell us what that means going forward. I think that means we now have a trial date for sometime in Q1 of next year.
Yes. So I think a lot of us were not surprised that she denied the appeal, because the basis for which her judgment was made, the law that she applied is not, the law is not at issue here. The Howey case, which we've all talked about ad nauseum, is the correct law to apply to these set of facts. And so the SEC, in their appeal, were trying to sort of, sidestep that issue and make other arguments. But ultimately, that is the ruling case law, and she applied that case law on a very distinct set of facts. So I wasn't surprised that the interlocutory appeal was denied. And I think that, the case will move forward, and the government will have a chance at the end of the case to appeal this. They'll have to find the grounds to do it, but they will have a chance. They haven't lost their chance to appeal. They just lost their chance to appeal in the middle of the process.
Josh, let's go to you on that. And I wanted to ask, in the context of these decisions, one of the things that lay people I see, certainly is this perspective from the SEC that it's a security, and I'm only paraphrasing, this hasn't been written, it's a security because we say it's a security, therefore all of the actions we're taking going forward are relevant to this case. And when you look at the Ripple decision, when you look at Coinbase, which we'll get to in a second, there seems to be this judicial perspective that slow down, SEC. That may not exactly be the case. Do you, as an attorney, do you see it that way? Is that a proper representation of what's happening?
Of judges saying slow down, SEC?
Or of Ron saying the SEC keeps saying it's a security because we say it's a security? Josh, for the first time ever, speechless.
Yeah, I think many of the courts are seeing things that conflict with each other, right? Mm. Because certainly we have Judge Rakoff in the SEC v. Terraform Labs Do Kwon case, certainly a different procedural stage, saying, well, yeah, this is a security, or not exactly that. That's a paraphrase, and not even, that's just me kind of joking around, but really saying that he disagreed with the very reasoning of Judge Torres. So in that instance, Judge Rakoff took an expansive view of what constitutes a scheme. And I think many in our industry and in other cases have said, actually, what is being asserted as being a scheme that goes beyond what perhaps the precedent says. And I think we've seen that in some of the other cases involving, say, trading platforms, right? And so I don't necessarily know that all judges are sort of singing from the same book, right? I do think there seems to be a lot less deference to the SEC than I think many anticipated, and perhaps even the SEC anticipated. I do think it's an interesting result. I think with the denial of the interlocutory appeal, I think on one hand, it's quite positive for Ripple, right? And we'll have to take it through to the end of the trial for the SEC to appeal. But I do think it adds a layer of an uncertainty, which could be very helpful to those in the industry. When you are citing to different cases or looking for persuasive or other authority, even if you're in a different jurisdiction, that we have this split within the same district. So, yeah.
And Josh, to that point, when I read Judge Torres's decision on the SEC appeal, if I recall correctly, the SEC specifically invoked Judge Rakoff's opinion in the Terra case. And Judge Torres's response, and I'm totally paraphrasing, really was stunning to me, which was, SEC, you invoked this claiming X, not so. You basically got that incorrectly, which was, for a non-lawyer like me, was stunning. David, did you react the same way? And it really is, to me, interesting that Judge Torres really is aware deeply of some of the issues that are being addressed.
Look, I think that there's a few things at play. Like if we zoom out for a minute, you're now seeing the first defendants in these crypto cases who are well-funded, who have thoughtful defenses, who have amicus filings on their behalf, be in these litigations. And so you're really seeing the full legal arguments for the crypto industry being brought to bear in these cases. And so I think we need to keep that in mind too, because it's not just the commission going after a poorly funded small startup. You're really seeing that, and you're seeing the arguments made. And I think where the SEC really hurt themselves here is that on one hand, you're saying the law is unclear and you have a right for an appeal based on that. But on the other hand, you're saying you're citing a case for another judge in the same circuit who's applying the same law. And so I think Judge Torres didn't necessarily appreciate a view that maybe the SEC was sort of talking out of both sides of their mouth a little bit in her eyes. And so she sort of took them to task for that a little bit, in her opinion.
David, while we're on this topic, obviously it wasn't just the Ripple case, it was also Coinbase. Coinbase filed a motion to dismiss. The SEC appealed. The SEC asked the judge to deny the motion to dismiss. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. And I'm sure Josh will want to jump in too. I think Kayvon, who's a good friend of ours. And
Shout out to Kayvon Sadeghi.
He really kind of crystallized the point that, the SEC is really trying to expand the definition of scheme, but, in their brief, they cited no case law in this attempt to expand the notion of scheme. And so I think that's pretty telling as far as sort of the creativity that they've been working with to try and expand their view. And I think it's just important just to recognize that and, appreciate that fact that the law really doesn't support that perspective, or the law up to this point has not supported that perspective. And so I think Kayvon did a nice job there of pointing it out for people to see that.
Self-servingly, Kayvon will be on our Crypto Investor Summit on the 23rd, which I'll talk about more. Josh, but weigh in on that if you wouldn't mind.
So, I think in general, yeah, it's very important that these things be brought out. And I think the amicus briefs that people have been writing have been tremendously important. And going even beyond, the scheme, right? I think scheme definition, not like any particular scheme or plan. But if we think back to some of the many enforcement actions that were resulted in a settlement, and we look at some of the court decisions that have come out recently, something that is not specific to the digital asset space, but it does use one of those tests that comes up in the digital asset space, relates to a decision known as Kirshner, which is recent, and it dealt with whether certain notes, right, whether term loans essentially are securities, and the court in that case found that they were not, even though they did have notes. They were not securities, but they used the test for notes because that it was enunciated in Reeves.
Yep.
Right. And that's also known as the family resemblance test. If we look back to say the BlockFi settlement, what did they agree? Well, at least for purposes of the settlement, it was stated that the BIAs, the BlockFi investment accounts, were notes, right? And Reeves was applied. And so just, I think some of what we're seeing across the board with courts and having less of and actually, interestingly, in Kirshner, the SEC did not weigh in, even though it was asked to weigh in. I do wonder whether, why, and whether maybe they didn't want to the implications of if term loans were securities, but also, if they made arguments and the court disagreed with them, or if they made arguments and the court did agree with them, could those arguments be used against them in another context, such as the digital asset space? But I think we're going to see, I think we already are seeing people being more willing to roll the dice potentially on defending themselves if they can, rather than necessarily just settling.
Particularly well-funded. Go ahead, David.
Yeah, Ron, I just want to say that also, I think there are some very strong arguments why those notes in the crypto context were not securities. And just because BlockFi decided to settle and not litigate that shouldn't be a presumption that what they were offering were securities. And I think that's important. I think it's very important for our audience and everyone in general to remember that a settlement does not create law here.
Right.
So a party can settle, they may admit or deny. Usually they don't admit or deny liability, but that is not controlling precedent when a company settles with the government.
David, so important, especially for the folks who are not in the legal business. Thank you both. I want to move forward. There's a lot to cover. One of the things we noted, David, I'd be remiss if we didn't talk about markets.
Yes.
This morning at 8:30, we got the latest job numbers, and they blew through the highest estimates that we had. I think the median was 170,000 jobs, something like 330 some odd jobs came in. So what that means to dumb folks like me is that the Fed will need to continue raising interest rates. So I always watch the price action. David, you and I and Joshua for a long time have spoken about crypto being a risk on, crypto being a hedge. I'm fascinated by the fact that Bitcoin is up still 66% year to date. What do you see in that data? What do you see in the numbers around the financial markets? And what is the economy going to do to the crypto markets going forward?
So, look, I mean, I think a lot of us are starting to wonder about the quality of that data and the movements and the restatements of the data month after month.
Yep.
I think fundamentally, like that really has to be looked at in greater detail. Like if you think about it, all the different banks who cover the space, this estimate that came in surpassed all of their estimates. And these are some very, very smart people. So I just wonder, what is the quality of the data? And why are we seeing such, wide ranges of redos and restatements? Broadly speaking, the bond market has been flashing that yields are going up.
Yep.
And it's really, outpaced the stock market with that. So then the bond market's been saying yields are going to be higher. And the issue is that when money is not as cheap to borrow, that has typically been an issue for the prices of crypto. So, the lower the price of money is, more liquidity in the market, people will go down the risk curve and they will go into crypto and other riskier assets. As money is going to get tightened and become more expensive, the question is, where will we see crypto go? And my sense is that there are a couple of intervening events here. And one is, I think crypto got way oversold when it went down at the beginning of last year. And so while we've seen it up a lot this year, I don't know that it's a reflection necessarily of a mispricing. I just think in a moment in time, because there's so much leverage in crypto, it probably fell further than it should. Yep. But secondarily, I think that there is this belief among some people that we're going to see a Bitcoin ETF in the next 3 to 6 months.
Yep.
And I think the ability to unlock institutional capital and investments by folks in the space to buy Bitcoin through an ETF product, through a security, not be a accredited investor or or just a regular institution who can now buy these products, is this big liquidity overhang, and why I think there's sort of a little bit of a floor in the price of Bitcoin in particular and crypto generally.
So those are the reasons you're giving for Bitcoin and crypto generally maintaining prices. Josh, how do you see this? And again, I know the day-to-day view is not watching prices in the market, but certainly you deal with innovators and thought leaders in this space. I'd love your perspectives on that.
I mean, I think I'm the wrong person to weigh in on price action and things like that. But as to what David was saying about, whether crypto was oversold, I think I'm always heartened and really astounded by crypto's ability to keep going and bounce back, right? And the fact that we are where we are versus where we were a year ago, when many companies were going through turmoil, and now we're seeing potential new legislation, whether or not it gets passed in the near term, and really potentially favorable for the industry, or for many in the industry, legal decisions. I think even though we're going over the SBF trial now, it's happening in real time. People are down there watching it today. I think, I don't know, I always have a positive outlook in general.
You're generally optimistic.
I'm generally optimistic, yeah.
I'm going to add one thing, Ron.
Go for it.
We're part of a very resilient community. Just building the technology that's really going to be foundations for how financial markets work in the future. So I think even though we've had some failures with intermediaries, we always, I think the big picture has always been the technology works. We've had some issues with intermediaries, but things are moving forward and development is moving forward and use cases are moving forward. So I think that is somehow priced into this as well.
Builders keep building. Before we wrap up, David, Josh, I want to ask you both to put your Nostradamus hats on. Do we get an ETF, a Bitcoin spot ETF, before the end of the year? And nothing here is investment advice, folks, for any of you who are watching.
I'm going to say no. My hope is that we will see one in 2024. And I am curious to see if the SEC appeals the Grayscale decision. And the 45 days is coming up shortly.
That's right.
I think even if there was a willingness to move forward with these applications, which there may be, just the timing needed to approve the different aspects of these applications, I don't see one coming to market before the end of the year. The
Josh,
only caveat is if somehow Grayscale was allowed to convert GBTC into an ETF.
Right. Josh, no one will take the bet with me on the ETF coming up before the end of the year. What do you think?
So, unfortunately, I agree with David. And not unfortunately, in any sense other than I'm yet another person who won't take your bet, Ron. But
Okay.
yeah, so I mean, while it would be, I've certainly heard some predict it, right? And it certainly would be a big, splash and a big move forward for the industry. I just think, I mean, we're at October 6th right now, right? Like we're towards the end of the year, and I could be surprised, if I remember correctly, and I haven't thought about this in a long time, but didn't futures get launched for the first time in December of what year was that? Was that 20?
It was 2017, I think.
Yeah. So it could be, but I think I'm less optimistic, especially when we're grappling with things like, will there be a government shutdown?
Fair point.
Things like that.
David, Josh, thank you both so much. For everyone who joined us, thank you so much for joining us. This video will be available continually on LinkedIn and Twitter, as well as the WSBA YouTube channel. I want to throw out the public announcement there. David and Josh, if you don't mind, you're both joining us on Monday, October 23rd, the WSBA's Crypto Investor Summit live in person in New York City. Members will be there. We've got some great panels talking about many of the topics we discussed here. We do have a block of seats that are available for non-members publicly who want to join us. If you're looking for more information, check out our LinkedIn page, check out our profile on Twitter. We do have the links there as well. Or email us to info@wsba.co. David, Josh, before we wrap up, David, over the weekend, as you and Curly walk the beaches of the beachfront compounds, what will you be looking forward to next week? What are you looking at?
Well, I'm really curious about the price action. And what we've been seeing is a lot of retail investors have been selling crypto right now, and institutions are buying Bitcoin. So typically, unfortunately, when retail investors are selling, those typically are bottoms in the market. So we could be forming a bottom here. I'm not quite sure we're there yet, but I'm going to be following that, and also the Celsius process and their whether their plan of reorganization is going to be approved. And so I'm very curious about that. So I'm going to be reading up about that this weekend too.
Interesting stuff. Josh, when the helicopter picks you up and flies you back to the compound in New Jersey, what are you doing this weekend?
So it remains to be seen. I would say a lot of work, but also just in general, I'm now, especially that I attended the hearing yesterday, I feel like more invested in the, no pun intended, in the trial. And so I'm really curious to catch up on what happens today. I wish that I could have heard the end of Gary Wong's testimony. And I'm just...
Thank you both. I will spend the weekend debating whether or not to pick up Michael Lewis's book. I have colleagues telling me do it. I have others telling me don't do it. I won't weigh in, but I will let you all know next week. David, Josh, as always, a privilege. For everyone who joined us, thank you so much. We will see you next week. Bye-bye.
Right.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody.